I'm amazed by what's been taking place, because all the Canadians I've ever met are among the most delightful people I've come across anywhere on earth, and God knows I've met plenty of people. I find Canadians almost universally highly cultured, civilized, friendly, peaceful, reasonable people you can talk about with anything. And yet somehow you wonderful people, every so often, you allow a bunch of rampaging Neanderthals to trample all over you. I don't quite get it. It's happened with Clarkot Sound, it happened with the Grand Banks, it's happening with the tar sands, and now it's happening with Copenhagen. The distance between the sensibilities of ordinary Canadians and those who come to define Canada's image abroad by actions like that seems to be immense, an unbridgeable gulf. Now, I know that there's always a gap between a government and the people, and we sure as heck have got one in the UK. But I've never seen such a stark gap, such an enormous gulf as I perceive in Canada. Now, look, I'm an outsider, I don't know much about it, but all I can talk about is what I perceive as a foreigner, looking at this beautiful, staggering, amazing country, and just seeing how so many opportunities appear to be being squandered. And I see it not just from the point of view of a concerned citizen, but also from the point of view of someone who's been following as best I can the science of climate change for quite a few years now. And the 3 papers which have made the biggest impact on me were all published this year. The first one, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in February by Susan Solomon and others, showed that once you reach a certain concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's locked in for at least 1,000 years. She's talking about 450 parts per million or more. The reason for that is that beyond that point, the oceans cease to become an effective carbon sink due to changes in the circulation patterns which no longer bring carbon-poor water up from the depths to absorb carbon dioxide. As the surface waters heat, you don't get that sinking of cold water which drives so much of the circulation pattern. That's, if I've understood it correctly, it's pretty complicated. But anyway, what the paper shows is that you're locked in both to levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. So in other words, the old story that so many governments have told that we can overshoot the desirable level and then bring down the levels later on to where we want to be. That's only plausible if you're going to invest unbelievable trillions in carbon capture technology where you're actually absorbing it from the air, which is probably the most expensive way you could contemplate for trying to deal with climate change. But the other thing the paper showed was that once you reach a certain temperature, you're also locked into that temperature as a result of those feedback mechanisms as well. So if we hit 2 degrees at any time between now and 2300, we're stuck with 2 degrees, or in fact, it's probably going to go further because that kicks off further feedback loops. So 2 degrees is likely to give you 3 degrees as a result of the natural processes kicking in. 3 degrees is likely to give you 4 degrees. And so the message from that paper was very clear. There's no going back. Once you've committed yourself to that level of pollution, you can't row back on that level. That was followed at the end of April by 2 papers published in Nature, one by Miles Allen and others, and the other by Malte Meinshausen and others. And what they attempted to do was to relate the level beyond which governments have said they don't want to go, including, incidentally, at the G8 this year, the Canadian government said it didn't want to go beyond 2 degrees of warming. I mean, it's, as you know, it introduced no measures whatsoever which could bring that about, but that at any rate is the theory. If we want to stay within that limit and not go beyond 2 degrees, then they tried to work out how much carbon dioxide we could produce without breaching it. And they found, and it's quite similar to the findings in the Susan Solomon paper, they found that it doesn't matter when we produce that carbon dioxide. It's going to have the same impact. Any time between now and the next 500 years, It's going to, any given amount of carbon dioxide produced in that time is going to push us a certain distance towards that 2-degree limit, and the timing of the emissions is irrelevant. They came up with what appears to be an absolute limit for how much CO2 you can produce and not breach the all-important 2-degree threshold. And having read those papers, I then went to the World Energy Council site, and I found the stated reserves of oil, coal, and gas. And then I went and found the average carbon content of the oil, coal, and gas in those stated reserves, and did a couple of quick and very simple calculations. Now, before I explain them to you, reserves are not the same as resources. Reserves are that part of a mineral resource which is good to go. In other words, which has been discovered, prospected, identified, it's economically viable, the technology exists to exploit it, all you need is a go-ahead and you can dig that out of the ground. The resource, by contrast, is all of that mineral which is held in the Earth's crust. And typically the reserve is just a small fraction of the total resource. So we're talking already about a small fraction, this identified reserve. And I found that when you added up the coal, oil, and gas, and I didn't even try to tackle the unconventionals because the calculations are very complicated indeed, and in fact probably impossible because we don't know enough about the different carbon contents. I found that the absolute maximum that we can afford to get out of the ground and burn is 60% of current reserves between now and 2500 if we're to avoid 2 degrees of warming. I also found that we're on course to burn that amount of fossil fuel by 2050 at the latest on current trajectories. So in other words, that 500-year supply we're intending to burn, or certainly unless things change radically, by 2050. So two things immediately jump out at you. One is that if we are serious about tackling climate change and preventing more than 2 degrees of warming, which almost all governments on Earth now say they are serious about, we have to decide which reserves we are not going to dig out of the ground. Two, having made that decision, we have to put a total moratorium on all further prospecting for fossil fuel reserves and stop all further prospecting and development of new reserves, in other words, taking any more out of the resource and turning it into reserves which should be ready to go. And this has startling and shocking implications, really. You find that it's completely at odds with the plans of almost all the world's governments. In fact, there's a stark contradiction between the two positions that governments which do have a sensible policy or half-sensible policy on climate change maintain, where on the one hand they say you must reduce your consumption of fossil fuels, and whatever you do, you must use fewer fossil fuels by having more efficient cars and by changing your light bulbs and by insulating your loft and by having double glazing and all these perfectly reasonable measures which we all ought to be doing. That's fine. Cut down your consumption of fossil fuels. At the same time, all the governments on Earth that I can think of, bar one, have a policy of maximizing the supply of fossil fuels. So they're trying to minimize the demand and maximize the supply. In fact, I can quote from the British government's energy policy paper, where it says, our aim is to maximize the economic potential of coal, oil and gas on the UK continental shelf. And this came just a few paragraphs after they were talking about how they were going to stop people from using coal, oil and gas. The only country which is trying to restrict the supply of fossil fuels is Saudi Arabia. And it's not doing it for the purposes of climate change. And indeed, whenever Saudi Arabia closes a tap a little bit, all the world's governments jump up and down and say, this is outrageous, you must open up the supply again. And of course, we must stop using it. So this contradiction has to be resolved. And the only way it can sensibly be resolved is, as I say, a decision to invest in the only form of carbon capture and storage which is known to work, is geologically stable, scientifically proven and completely safe, leaving fossil fuels in the ground.